When the small brown bottle slipped from Judy Garland's trembling hand and rolled across the Tonight Show desk, nobody in that studio breathed. Stopped directly in front of Johnny Carson. He looked down at it. He looked up at her. And in the 3 seconds before either of them moved, 300 people in that audience understood, with a clarity that no amount of careful publicity management could ever undo, exactly what they were looking at. But what happened after Carson picked that bottle up off the desk, what he did with it, and what Judy Garland said to him in the 60 seconds that followed, has never been told the way it actually happened. Wait, because the story of how that bottle ended up in her hand in the first place goes back 29 years, to a soundstage where a 12-year-old girl was handed something by a studio doctor and told it would help her keep working, and nobody thought to ask whether a 12-year-old should ever have to keep working that hard in the first place. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something directly. I see in the comments every single week that people who have watched this channel for months did not realize they were never subscribed. Take 10 seconds right now, check. It costs nothing and it means the next story reaches you the moment it's ready. Thank you for being here. Now let's go back. Not to a television studio in the 1960s, to a film studio in the 1930s, where a little girl with an extraordinary voice was about to become one of the most valuable assets in the history of American entertainment, and where the machinery built to protect that value would end up costing her almost everything a person actually needs to survive. Frances Ethel Gum was born on June 10, 1922, in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, the youngest of 3 daughters in a vaudeville family that performed together as a singing act almost as soon as the girls could stand upright on a stage. By the time she was 2.5 years old, Frances was already performing publicly, and by the time her family relocated to Los Angeles when she was 4, in pursuit of the specific and merciless ambition that drove so many families toward Hollywood in that era, it had already become clear to everyone around her that she possessed something rare, a voice with an emotional depth and technical control that seemed to belong to someone decades older than the small child producing it. She was renamed Judy Garland at 13, and at that same age, in 1935, she was signed to a long-term contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, one of the most powerful studios in the history of American film, a studio that operated, in those years, with a system of control over its young performers that would be recognized today as something closer to institutionalized abuse than career management. But nobody called it that then. Then it was simply how the business worked. Wait, because what happened to Judy Garland inside that system is the part of the story that almost nobody who has only seen The Wizard of Oz has ever fully understood. And it explains everything about what fell out of her hand on that Tonight Show desk 3 decades later. MGM studio executives were obsessed, in a way that went beyond ordinary professional concern, into something closer to compulsion, with controlling every aspect of Judy Garland's physical presentation, her weight, her energy, her sleep, her waking hours, treating her body as a piece of studio property to be maintained and adjusted according to production schedules, rather than as the body of an actual child. She was put on amphetamines by studio doctors as early as 13 years old, medications designed to keep her energetic and thin enough to satisfy the specific physical standards the studio demanded. Medications, she was told, by adults she had every reason to trust, would help her perform at the level everyone expected of her. When those same amphetamines made it impossible for her to sleep at night, the same studio doctors gave her barbiturates to bring her down, to force her small body into unconsciousness, so that she could wake the next morning and be given amphetamines again to start the entire cycle over. This was not an occasional intervention during a difficult production. This became, for Judy Garland, the basic architecture of her daily existence throughout her teenage years, a chemical cycle imposed on her by adults whose salaries depended on her continued productivity, a cycle that no 13-year-old, no matter how talented or resilient, should ever have been made to carry. But there was something else happening during those years that almost nobody outside her immediate circle understood at the time, something that would not become clear until decades later, when a handful of people who had actually witnessed it finally spoke, long after Judy Garland herself was gone, and could no longer be hurt by the telling of it. What you have seen so far is nothing compared to what actually happened on the set of The Wizard of Oz in 1938, when Judy Garland was 16 years old. During the production of The Wizard of Oz, according to accounts that eventually surfaced from crew members and studio staff who worked on the film, Judy Garland's daily schedule was managed with a level of control that extended into details most people would never imagine a studio dictating for a 16-year-old actress. Her meals were monitored and restricted. She was reportedly given diet pills disguised in various ways, along with, according to some of the accounts that later emerged, coffee and cigarettes as an appetite suppression strategy, all administered by adults who understood, at some level, that what they were doing to a teenager's body and nervous system was not something they wanted publicly documented. She has said, in later interviews given as an adult, that during this period she often felt like she was being watched constantly, evaluated constantly, and that the specific terror of disappointing the studio, of being seen as difficult or unreliable or worst of all, as not thin enough or not energetic enough, became the dominant emotional experience of her entire adolescence, larger than any ordinary teenage anxiety, larger than anything her actual peers were experiencing at that age. She once said in a much later interview that she felt like MGM owned her, not employed her, owned her, in the specific and total sense of that word, and that the studio's control over her body through medication was simply the most literal expression of an ownership that extended into every other part of her existence as well. Wait, because what happened to her body chemistry during those adolescent years would follow her for the rest of her life, in ways that no amount of adult resilience or professional success would ever fully undo. And it explains, with a clarity that almost nobody understood until decades later, exactly what happened on that Tonight Show stage in the winter of 1963. By the time Judy Garland appeared on The Tonight Show that winter, she was 40 years old, one of the most celebrated performers in the history of American entertainment, an Academy Award nominee, a woman whose voice had defined the emotional register of an entire generation's relationship to popular music and film. She had also, by that point, survived 5 marriages, several suicide attempts that the press covered with a specific cruelty that would be unimaginable by contemporary standards, and a dependency on prescription medication that had been imposed on her before she was old enough to consent to any of it, and that had never, in the intervening 27 years, been fully resolved, because the medical understanding of addiction in that era, and the specific complicating factor of medication that had been forced on her as a child, rather than sought out by her as an adult, meant that nobody around her, including Judy herself, fully understood what recovery would even look like. She arrived at NBC Studios that afternoon in a state that her longtime accompanist later described, in a private conversation shared only decades afterward, as more fragile than he had seen her in months. She was, according to his account, shaking slightly when she arrived, a tremor she attempted to conceal, with the specific professional composure that 37 years in the entertainment industry had taught her to perform. Even when everything underneath that composure was falling apart. Wait, do not miss this next detail, because it explains everything about what happened less than an hour later. Johnny Carson had interviewed Judy Garland before, and he understood, with the particular sensitivity that had made him one of the most trusted interviewers in American television, that something about her presence that afternoon was different from her previous appearances. He has said, in a later reflection shared privately with people close to him, that he noticed it the moment she walked out from behind the curtain, a quality in her movement that seemed more careful than usual, as though she were concentrating specifically on the mechanics of walking in a way that a person does not typically need to concentrate on something so automatic. The interview began normally. She was warm, funny in the specific self-deprecating way that had always been part of her public charm, generous with the audience in a manner that made 300 people feel, collectively, that they were in the presence of someone genuinely extraordinary. She sang. The studio, predictably, fell into the kind of reverent silence that Judy Garland's voice had produced in audiences for nearly 3 decades, a silence that had nothing to do with politeness, and everything to do with the specific, overwhelming quality of what she was capable of producing with her voice even now, even at 40, even carrying everything she was carrying. But then, during a segment of ordinary conversation following the performance, something happened. Wait, because what you are about to learn about the next 90 seconds is the part of this story that Johnny Carson himself would carry privately for the rest of his life. Judy Garland reached into the small evening bag she had brought onto the stage with her, a gesture that appeared to the audience entirely ordinary, the kind of small unconscious movement that guests sometimes made during interviews, checking for a handkerchief or a compact, nothing that registered as significant in the moment. But her hand, according to what the show's floor manager later described, was shaking more than it had been earlier in the segment, a tremor that had visibly worsened over the preceding 20 minutes. And as she withdrew her hand from the bag, something slipped from her fingers. A small brown prescription bottle. It fell onto the surface of the Tonight Show desk with a soft sound that the studio microphones picked up clearly, a sound that cut through the ordinary background hum of the broadcast in a way that made several members of the crew, watching from the wings, go completely still. The bottle rolled a few inches across the polished wood and came to rest directly in front of Johnny Carson. Wait, do not miss what happened in the next 3 seconds, because it reveals something about Johnny Carson that almost nobody who has only seen his public persona would expect. Carson looked down at the bottle. He did not pick it up immediately. He looked up at Judy Garland, and what passed between them in that moment, according to the account of a camera operator who was positioned close enough to see both of their faces clearly, was not the reaction of a shocked professional trying to manage an unexpected on-air incident. It was something quieter, something that the camera operator described years later as the specific look of two people who have both, in their own separate ways, spent their entire adult lives performing composure in front of audiences that had no idea what that performance actually cost them. Judy Garland's face in that moment held an expression the camera operator said he had never forgotten, something between humiliation and a strange, exhausted relief, as though some part of her had simply gotten tired of holding everything together and had, without any conscious decision on her part, let one small piece of the truth fall out into the open where everyone could see it. Carson reached down. He picked up the bottle. He did not read the label aloud. He did not make a joke, which would have been the easiest and most natural thing for a talk show host in his position to do. The reflexive deflection that live television so often demands in moments of unexpected tension. Instead, he simply held it for a moment in his open palm, and then quietly, in a voice that the studio microphones caught but that he clearly intended to keep as private as a live broadcast allowed, he said something to her. Wait, because what he said and what she said back to him is the part of this story that has taken decades to fully surface, according to the account that eventually emerged, pieced together from the recollections of several people who were present that day and who spoke about it only years later, after both Judy Garland and Johnny Carson had died. Carson said to her quietly, "Are you all right?" Not a performative question designed to smooth over an awkward moment for the cameras, but a genuine question, asked with the specific directness of someone who already suspected he knew the answer and was giving her the option. And only the option to tell him the truth if she wanted to. Judy Garland was quiet for a moment. The studio audience, sensing that something had shifted in the texture of the broadcast, even though most of them could not have said exactly what had happened, had gone unusually still. The specific collective attention of an audience that understands, without being told directly, that it is witnessing something that has moved outside the boundaries of ordinary entertainment. She said, according to the account, not today. 2 words. Not a denial. Not an explanation. Simply an answer to the actual question he had asked, delivered with a specific, weary honesty that several people who heard it later said was more devastating than any elaborate confession could have been. Carson held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he did something that nobody who was there that day ever forgot. He set the bottle gently back down on the desk, closer to her side than to his. A small and specific gesture of returning something to its owner without judgment, and he said, quietly enough that only she and the people nearest the stage could hear it clearly, Then let's just talk. Wait, because what happened in the conversation that followed changed the entire tone of that broadcast, and it reveals something about what Judy Garland had actually been carrying for nearly 3 decades by that point. What followed was not the segment that had been planned. Carson set aside the notes his producers had prepared for him and simply talked with Judy Garland. For the better part of the next 15 minutes, about things that had nothing to do with promoting a project or reminiscing about old films in the polished, familiar way that talk show interviews with legendary performers typically proceeded. He asked her what it had actually been like being a child inside the studio system, not the sanitized version she had given in 100 previous interviews, the version with the funny anecdotes about difficult directors and demanding schedules, but the real texture of it, the actual daily experience of being a 12-year-old handed medication by adults who were supposed to be protecting her. And Judy Garland, for reasons that she herself likely could not have fully articulated in that moment, reasons connected perhaps to the specific vulnerability of having just dropped that bottle in front of 300 people, or perhaps simply to the particular quality of safety that Carson's quiet question had created, began to answer honestly, in a way she had rarely done in any public setting before that afternoon. She talked about the amphetamines. She talked about the exhaustion of never being allowed to simply be tired, of having that exhaustion chemically overridden again and again, until her body no longer understood what its own natural rhythms were supposed to feel like. She talked about how frightened she had been as a child, of disappointing the adults who controlled every aspect of her existence, and how that fear had never fully left her, even now, even as one of the most celebrated performers alive. The studio audience, 300 people who had come expecting an entertaining evening of songs and light conversation, sat in a silence that several people who were present described, years later, as the most complete silence they had ever experienced in a live audience. The specific quiet of people who understand they are witnessing something true and are afraid that any sound they make might interrupt it. Wait, because what Judy Garland said next is the detail that changes everything about how this entire story should be understood. Judy Garland said at one point during that unplanned conversation that she sometimes felt as though the studio had taken something from her at 12 years old that she had spent every year since then, trying unsuccessfully to get back. Not her career, not her talent, something more fundamental than that. She said she felt as though she had never actually been allowed to be a child, not for one single uninterrupted day, and that somewhere inside her, a 12-year-old girl was still waiting for someone to simply let her rest without consequence, without medication, without the specific terror of disappointing people whose approval had been made to feel like the only thing standing between her and complete catastrophe. Johnny Carson, according to the accounts of people present that day, did not try to fix this or offer reassurance that felt hollow given what she had just described. He simply said quietly that he was sorry that happened to her, and that whatever came next in her life, she deserved, at minimum, the chance to finally put some of that weight down. Judy Garland was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that the studio audience, and later the people who eventually pieced together the fuller account of that broadcast, would remember as one of the most striking things ever said on that stage in the entire history of the program. She said, "Thank you for not making a joke about the bottle. Everyone always makes a joke. You didn't." Wait, because this single sentence explains, more completely than anything else in this story, exactly what Judy Garland had actually been living with for nearly 3 decades, in an industry that had built an entire economy around laughing at her pain rather than acknowledging its cause. The broadcast ran over its scheduled time that evening, and NBC's switchboard, according to the account of the production staff who monitored it, received an unusually high volume of calls in the hours immediately following, many of them from viewers who wanted simply to express that they had never seen Judy Garland, or any performer of her stature, speak with that particular quality of unguarded honesty about the machinery that had shaped their careers. Some of the calls came from people who had themselves struggled with addiction, and who said specifically that hearing someone as beloved and as talented as Judy Garland describe her own struggle without shame, and hearing an interviewer respond to that struggle with basic human decency rather than mockery or moral judgment, had made them feel, for the first time in years, that recovery might actually be something available to people like them as well. Judy Garland never publicly referenced the incident with the bottle in any subsequent interview during her lifetime. She died on June 22, 1969, at the age of 47, and the specific circumstances of her death, connected once again to the medication that had been imposed on her body since childhood, were reported by a press that had, in many ways, never fully reckoned with its own role in creating the conditions that made her final years so difficult. Johnny Carson, in a private reflection shared many years later with a close friend who kept detailed notes of significant conversations throughout his life, said that the afternoon with Judy Garland had changed something in his understanding of what his job actually required of him. He said he had learned, watching that small brown bottle roll across his desk, that the most important thing an interviewer could sometimes do was not ask the clever question or produce the entertaining moment, but simply notice when a person in front of him needed, more than anything else, to be treated as a human being rather than as a headline waiting to happen. He said he thought about that afternoon every single time a guest in obvious distress sat across from him in the following decades, and that he tried every single time to give them the same thing he had given Judy Garland that day: the simple decision not to make a joke about the bottle. There is one more detail about that afternoon that almost nobody has ever fully pieced together. Something that only becomes clear when you understand the full weight of what Judy Garland carried from childhood forward. After the broadcast ended, according to the account of her longtime accompanist, Judy Garland asked to keep the bottle rather than have it returned to her bag by an assistant in the ordinary way. She held it, he said, for a long moment backstage, turning it over once in her hand, before finally putting it away herself. He asked her gently if she was all right. She told him, according to his account, that for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked at that bottle and seen a person who needed help rather than a scandal waiting to be reported. She said that Johnny Carson had given her something that afternoon that almost nobody in her entire professional life had ever given her: the simple dignity of being asked, honestly, whether she was okay without any performance attached to either the question or the answer. If this story has moved you tonight, I want you to sit with something for a moment before you close this video. Judy Garland spent nearly her entire life being managed, medicated, and monetized by an industry that valued her talent far more than it valued her well-being. And in one unplanned moment on a television stage, a single act of basic human decency from someone willing to simply ask if she was all right meant more to her than almost anything else she experienced in her professional career. Think about the people in your own life who might be carrying something similar right now, something they have learned to hide behind careful composure, because every previous attempt to reveal it was met with judgment rather than genuine concern. You do not need to fix it. You do not need the perfect words. You simply need to ask, honestly, are you all right? And then actually wait for the real answer instead of the one that makes everyone comfortable. If you have not yet joined this channel's community, please consider doing so now. The link is below, and becoming a member helps make these deeply researched stories possible for everyone who watches. Please like this video if it moved you tonight, because every single like helps this story find someone else who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already, so the next story reaches you the moment it is ready. And in the comments below, tell me, has someone ever asked you genuinely if you were all right at exactly the moment you needed someone to ask? Tell me about it. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. Because somewhere out there right now, someone is holding their own version of that small brown bottle, waiting for someone to simply ask the question without making a joke about it. There is something else about that afternoon that deserves to be understood more fully. Something that goes back even further than the moment the bottle fell. Back to the specific years of Judy Garland's childhood, when the pattern that would define the rest of her life was first being established by adults who should have known better. When she was filming Babes in Arms in 1939, the same year The Wizard of Oz was released, a studio nurse reportedly kept a running schedule of exactly when Judy would receive her medication, timed precisely around her shooting schedule, so that she would be alert and energetic during her scenes, and then, once filming for the day concluded, given something else entirely to bring her back down so she could sleep the few hours available before the cycle began again the next morning. She was 14 years old. 14 years old, and already living inside a chemical schedule designed entirely around a production calendar, with almost no consideration given to what that cycle was actually doing to a developing adolescent body and mind. Her own mother, Ethel Gum, has been described by multiple biographers and by people who knew the family personally as deeply complicit in this system, prioritizing her daughter's earning potential and the family's financial security over any meaningful protection of Judy's health, a dynamic that left the young performer without a single reliable adult advocate inside the industry that controlled almost every hour of her waking life. Wait, because understanding this specific betrayal, the absence of any protective adult presence during the years when Judy Garland most needed one, is essential to understanding why a single moment of genuine human concern from Johnny Carson decades later meant as much to her as it clearly did. She had spent her entire childhood being told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that her value lay entirely in her productivity, in her ability to perform on schedule regardless of what her actual body needed. And by the time she sat across from Johnny Carson on that Tonight Show stage in 1963, she had been operating under that exact framework, in one form or another, for nearly 30 years. The bottle that fell from her hand that afternoon was not simply a single unfortunate incident. It was the physical manifestation of a wound that had been inflicted on her before she was old enough to understand what was happening to her. A wound that the entertainment industry had profited from for decades, while offering almost nothing in the way of genuine care or accountability. And in the specific, quiet decision Johnny Carson made that afternoon, to ask if she was all right rather than perform outrage or amusement for the cameras, Judy Garland experienced something that had been almost entirely absent from her professional life since she was 12 years old. An adult in a position of some authority choosing, deliberately to prioritize her humanity over the entertainment value of her distress.